Okay, welcome to the first of two seminars this week on graphic novels and graphic narratives. I'd like to thank Imrutha Mohan, who is a visiting scholar here at Cardiff University and a PhD candidate at the University of Kerala. She has curated, if you will, this series of talks, and she will be speaking tomorrow with Dr. Lisa El Raffig. However, today we welcome Dr. Nijdam from the University of British Columbia. She will be speaking today on graphic historiography, comics, and on the writing of history. Much of the material she will be presenting to us today comes from her monograph project, which will be published soon, entitled Graphic Historiography, East German Memory, Discourses in Comics and Graphic Novels, which will be published by Ohio State University Press. So Dr. Nijdam will be speaking to us for about 40 minutes, after which we will have about 20 minutes of questions. So over to you, Dr. Nijdam.
Thank you so much for the opportunity to present my research to you all. I'm really grateful for any opportunity that I get to transcend borders in sharing my love for comics and graphic art. But first of all, I'd like to begin by acknowledging the land upon which I performed the research for this project and from which I'm presenting it to you today, from the west coast of what is now called Canada. I'm currently talking to you from the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. I find these kind of online events and the lack of physical presence in our virtual meetings makes the importance of place even more palpable. So I'd like to express my sincere gratitude to the historic and contemporary caretakers of the work or of the land on which I work, learn, and teach. And so those of you who aren't familiar with Canadian scholars, land acknowledgements of the Indigenous peoples that have lived in the places that we work since time immemorial are a really important part of the work of truth and reconciliation that we're pursuing here in Canada. So I always like to begin with that, but also for international viewers to explain exactly what it is that I'm doing. So I'm just going to dive in because the presentation itself will talk a little bit about the book project from which it's coming. And I just wanted to thank the organizers again for this opportunity. Let me get my technology in line. There we go. In 2009, for the 20th anniversary of the fall of the Berlin Wall, 3 graphic novels were published narrating histories of the German Democratic Republic, or GDR. Simon Schwarz's Drüben, Claire Lenkova's Grenzgebiete, and Flix's Da war mal was. Directed at the generation of young adults who witnessed the collapse of the GDR, but were too young to understand the complexity of their country's divide. These comics recounted the experience of living in East Germany through the children that grew up there. However, as more graphic novels thematizing GDR history began to appear, what started as a commemoration of the fall of the Berlin Wall in 2009 has quickly turned into a trend in the representation of East German experience. My book project explores this body of fiction and nonfiction graphic narratives thematizing East German history as case studies through which to assess what comics do with historical representation, as much as what comics bring to historical representation. In particular, my research examines how comics reveal the processes of constructing, narrating, and presenting knowledge about historical experience in a variety of arenas of contemporary memory culture. Framing these comics as graphic historiography, in the sense that they comment on and illuminate the processes of historical writing by engaging in it, my work sets specific examples of graphic literature in dialogue with other media that seek to narrativize, exhibit, and memorialize history. My research thereby seeks to assess how comics and graphic novels both interrogate forms and forums of memory culture, as well as intervene in how we write, remember, exhibit, and picture history. My presentation today looks at 2 very different kinds of comics on East German history to demonstrate how graphic historiography reveals the essential processes of historical narrativization, while intervening in debates about historical truth and authenticity. My first example, Berlin, A Divided City, published in 2012 by Thomas Hensler and Susanna Budenberg, explores how comics and graphic novels engage documentary photography and historical documents to substantiate their narrativization of East German history, but in doing so, reveal what Bill Nichols calls the quote-unquote documentary gaze. Here I look at the role of documents in this so-called documentary comic to illuminate the relationship between nonfiction comics and other documentary formats, while probing the tensions that emerge between document and documentary in comics representation. Then turning to a significantly more lighthearted engagement with the quote-unquote historical archive, Marvel's Kinderland from 2014. The second part of my presentation reveals how even comics not preoccupied with the oppressive qualities of East German state socialism set themselves in dialogue with larger practices in East German memory culture, namely the Nostalgie phenomenon and the exhibition strategies that have emerged around East German material culture. So without further ado, let me begin. The first chapter of Thomas Hensler and Susanne Budenberg's Berlin, A Divided City, opens to an image of a public transportation ticket. The caption reads, S-Bahn ticket to West Berlin from August 16, 1961. As if pasted on the page, this document acts as a prologue to the chapter it precedes. Regina Ziewitz's biographical story, How the Wall Nearly Put an End to My High School Career. However, the detailed representation of the historical artifact stands in stark contrast to the illustrated mode of narrative storytelling that begins on the opposite page. Moreover, while the two do indeed share the same style of cartooning in their rendering, the S-Bahn ticket hails from a very different kind of historical representation than the graphic narrative to follow. As a document of East German lived experience, this object and its presentation, isolated on a blank page with only a caption to contextualize it, feels more akin to the aesthetics of the museum exhibition room or archive folder than a comic book collection of graphic biographies. In fact, several museums on East German history and culture feature this exact S-Bahn ticket in their collections. And so here's from 3 different museums from their digital archives. Yet the disparities between these 2 registers or modes of representation, the first archival and the second narrative, reveal a lot about the project in which they are set in dialogue and the potential goals behind the work of this graphic novel. With the combination of archival objects and narrative a common feature in nonfiction comics, historical artifacts have emerged as an important narrative element of comics on historical subjects, functioning as markers of authenticity and truth-telling, while revealing tensions between documentary media and the documents upon which they are premised in the process of narrating history. Berlin, A City Divided features 5 graphic biographies that focus on how one individual or family navigated the political oppression, divided city, and strict censorship laws of the GDR. With the exception of the Holzapfel family, Budenberg and Hensler relate each chapter in the first person, simulating the aesthetic of graphic autobiography. This technique also recalls a transcription of oral histories, a methodology that played a role in the artist's interviews with the protagonists. In Regina Ziewitz's How the Wall Nearly Put an End to My High School Career, a young woman must choose between her education and the country in which she grew up after the Berlin Wall was built in 1961. In Ursula Malchaug's The Hospital by the Wall, the protagonist recounts her experience working at Lazarus Hospital on the western side of the wall, where she witnesses numerous attempts to flee the GDR, one even fatal. The Holzapfel family's ziplining over the wall follows a family that escapes the GDR via a homemade zipline, narrowly missing detection by an East German border guard. Detlef Mate's The Other Side of the Wall tells the story of an amateur photographer who gets caught taking pictures of the restricted areas and so is subsequently imprisoned for 6 weeks. Lastly, Jan Hildebrandt's My 18th Birthday takes place on November 9th, 1989, recounting the protagonist's birthday celebration that ends with the opening of the Berlin Wall. While the biographies of these 5 protagonists are the focal point of the nonfiction stories themselves, readers of Berlin, A City Divided are immediately struck by the intense research and pedagogical nature of the 96-page book-bound graphic novel, also featuring maps and public transportation information, which direct readers to the important geographic sites of the graphic narratives, and alongside URLs to additional information. Berlin, A City Divided is an unusual example of historical narrativization, but also functions as a historical guide through the city. However, what sets the graphic novel apart from many other comics on East German history is its rigorous engagement with documents and documentary photography, archival material, and historical artifacts. In particular, each chapter opens with an object, setting both the tone and leitmotif of the graphic narrative to follow. While the incorporation of archival objects and documents into graphic novels on historical themes is not uncommon, with every chapter of this particular volume featuring a visual rumination on the archival version of the same story, and that's what we're seeing in this slide right now. Berlin, a city divided, immediately sets itself explicitly in dialogue with both the archival and exhibition practices of these same objects and cultural institutions around the nation, and in the genre of media representation most invested in engaging documents, performing documentation, and representing the real, namely documentary. Yet while these graphic narratives mobilize the modes of address and nonfiction narration of documentary media, painstakingly drawn by hand, these stories also unequivocally set themselves apart from other documentary modes of storytelling. How can cartooning, a medium that is inherently subjective through its artistic mode of representation, make claims to representing facts and historical events accurately? And in doing so, what are comics bringing to discourses of historical representation within which they are participating? Looking at this category of graphic narrative through the lens of documentary media, I examine the role of documents in documentary explorations of Berlin's divided past to illuminate what nonfiction comics bring to documentary discourses of history. As a reconstructed version of reality that relies heavily on sequentiality to make meaning, comic art, in fact, shares a lot with other documentary modes of production, specifically film. Furthermore, like nonfiction film, nonfiction comics make claims to truthfulness through a variety of formal, narrative, and historiographic strategies, while the critical assessment of their variability to represent the real similarly positions them side by side with criticisms of other documentary media. These parallels have consequently led some scholars to examine nonfiction comics as also documentary format. In documentary comics, graphic truth-telling in a skeptical age, in particular, Nina Mikwitz defines the documentary nature of the comics medium in direct relationship to film. Mikwitz's project, in fact, seeks to connect a body of nonfiction comics through their documentary impulse as, quote, personal responses to real events that are interwoven with accounts of specific socio-historical issues and contexts, end quote. Importantly, the literature contained within this category of nonfiction comics would otherwise differentiate itself in terms of genre, aesthetic strategies, and narrative structures, moving between journalism, reportage, and autobiography. Mikwitz's project, therefore, unifies disparate comics through their shared, quote, ambition to mediate actual events in the real world, end quote, doing so through a classification of them as documentary comics. However, Mikwitz's attention to nonfiction comics as documentary focuses more on content than form in its endeavor to address documentary modes of storytelling in comics and graphic novels. Yet with comics explicitly emerging alongside other nonfiction's accounts of the same historical events, Mikwitz's inquiry on what comics contribute to documentary projects more generally provides a powerful intervention in critical assessments of documentary media that form the foundation of my work. Similarly, evaluating a body of comics in terms of their documentary impulse, my research aligns its goals with many of those expressed in Mikwitz's work. However, there's one key element differentiating our approaches to documentary comics and the scholarship upon which it is grounded. There isn't just one definition of documentary, which both complicates and clarifies the work undertaken in my examination of documentary media. As an adjective, Merriam-Webster defines documentary as, quote, being or consisting of documents, contained or certified in writing documentary evidence, end quote, as well as, quote, of relating to or employing documentation in literature or art, end quote. Similarly, Collins' English Dictionary defines documentary as akin to documental, as such, quote, consisting of, derived from, or relating to documents, end quote. This refocusing on documents, which occurs when one shifts from the nominal to the adjectival version of documentary, underscores several observations that fundamentally connect documentary film to nonfiction comics on historical themes. In other words, in shifting our perspective to the adjectival version of the same term, documentary's emphasis also shifts. As John Corner has also suggested, quote, the term documentary is always much safer when used as an adjective rather than a noun, end quote, redeploying the inflection towards documentary as more objects than practice. Hilary Schute's assessment of comics in disaster-drawn visual witness comics in documentary form, for example, mobilizes the second definition of documentary, in which she frames comics as a form of documentary, quote, as a form of witnessing, end quote. Here, Shute positions comics with its collection of frames as revealing of the, quote, inclination to document, end quote, drawing on the adjectival definition of documentary as the presentation of evidence, quote, in its succession of replete frames, comics call attention to itself, specifically as evidence, end quote. In this sense, Shute frames cartooning as the process of seeing. However, while comics embody the impulse to document at the very foundation of their formal innovations, at the same time, Shute argues, comics reveal an anxiety about what counts as evidence at their very core. Quote, functioning conspicuously in two different narrative registers, the word and image form of comics expands the reach of documentary, recording facts while also questioning the very project of what it means to document, to archive, to inscribe. Pitting visual and verbal discourses against each other, comics call attention to their virtues and to their friction, highlighting the issues of what counts as evidence, end quote. Comics as documents, namely documentary comics, thereby highlight the strengths and contradictions at the foundation of conceptions of evidentiary proof, drawing attention to the different registers through which narrative can claim authenticity, and specifically in this comic's historicity. So in the same sense that cartooning itself can be perceived as, to quote Michael Taussig, seeing, documentary comics is in fact documentation. This process of articulation through pen, ink, and or digital manipulation reveals both the way through which we collect evidence of the real as much as how we deploy this evidence in an effort to construct a particular understanding of an event, moment in time, person, monument, or situation. In other words, to create a story about human experience. Comics thus illuminate how documentary media put the world into view, namely through the documentary gaze. In his theorization of the documentary gaze, Bill Nichols adapts Laura Mulvey's conception of the male gaze in cinema to documentary. According to Mulvey, the male gaze constitutes a particular way of looking at women in film that also informs the narratives constructed about women. Mobilizing the framework in the context of documentary film, however, Nichols applies similar principles to understand the way politics, hierarchies of power, and desire manifest in nonfiction media. Quote, we see views of the world and what they put before us as social issues and cultural values, current problems and possible solutions, actual situations and specific ways of representing them, end quote. Framing, quote, documentary as discourse about the world, end quote, instead of a representation of it, Nichols' assessment of how the politics of the documentary gaze manifests through the capacities of documentary media to, quote, reproduce the physical appearance of things, end quote, and which sheds light on the constructed nature of documentary film and its consequent impact on how the formal characteristics of documentary media contribute to the formation of popular memory. Here, Nichols is exploring the role of documentary film in constructing the popular imagination. However, these observations also apply to other documentary modes of representing the world. Through its status as evidence from the world, documentary media has the power to, quote, provoke or encourage response, shape attitudes and assumptions, end quote. Yet, as Nichols notes, documentary media problematically offer more pleasure and appeal the more their structure remains invisible. He writes, quote, "A good documentary stimulates discussion about its subject, not itself," end quote. While this serves as a popular understanding of what documentary film should accomplish, it neglects to acknowledge how crucial rhetoric and form are to the realization of this goal. Documentary media that claims to be representing real events, people, and places seeks to foster the illusion that what occurred in front of the camera was not enacted with the camera in mind. Quote, "It would have existed, the events would have unfolded, the social actors would have lived and made a presentation of themselves in everyday life, irrespective of the camera's presence," end quote. However, the process of documentary media complicate this goal with the strategies by which documentary attempts to demonstrate its truthfulness, choices about subject matter, about the form of expression, about the point of view, about the storyline, about the audience, undermining any ability to represent an authentic version of the real altogether. Any attempt at representation alters that which is represented. Thus, it follows the act of seeing plainly modifies what it sees. Moreover, with most documentary media also adopting the conventions, strategies, and structures of narrative of similar representations of its themes, the line between fiction and nonfiction is further muddied. Thus, in considering the documentary gaze, Nichols asks us to examine how the camera's perspective, quote, "takes on distinctive qualities and poses concrete issues of politics, ethics, and ideology," end quote. Produced with a specific point of view and with the cultural perspectives and prejudices of the day embedded in every shot, documentary media is perhaps in fact just as storied and subjective as narrative featured film. Documentary media is thus itself an artifact unto itself. This is why Stella Bruzzi, for example, applauds film that are all about the fluctuation between what's staged and what's real, asserting that audiences can learn something valuable about film's ability to play and manipulate ideas of truth on screen. So while more often than not seeking to obfuscate its mediation and manipulation of reality, these processes in fact reveal a lot about documentary film and consequently popular imaginings of certain facts, experiences, and realities. The way in which documentary media simultaneously document the processes of documentation, thereby reveal the biases, assumptions, and prejudices embedded at the very foundation of this work. This begs the question, what does the comics medium bring to these debates on the mediation of documentary image, especially in the case of Berlin, A City Divided? Documents themselves are integrated into the comics representation to further posit while also potentially undermining the very idea of authenticity. Returning to Berlin, A City Divided, to quote Nichols again, the remediation of documentary media literally draws attention to the separation between an image and what it refers to, which, quote, "is the difference that makes a difference." Our access to historical reality may only be by means of representations, and these representations may sometimes seem to be more eager to chase their own tails than able to guarantee the authenticity of what they refer to. Neither of these conditions, however, precludes the persistence of history as a reality with which we must contend, end quote. So if documentary can no longer be framed as an objective rumination on the present or past, but instead a subjective view of its object of inquiry, what makes documentary media documentary is ultimately, according to Divan, the way we look at it. So in Budenberg and Hensler's remediation of documentary evidence, the illustrated versions of these archival objects or documentary photographs encourage readers to think about the way we look at images of historical importance, uncovering the gaps between our understanding of history, its representation, and the impossibility of authenticity altogether. This disconnect between what is represented and what is real, and how what is represented shapes our understanding of what is real, is at the foundation of Nichols' documentary gaze. Thus, comics that remediate the documentary gaze through the illustration of documentary evidence and literally draw attention to the way we look at history and the construction of historical representation through documentary modes. Now I shall turn to a very different kind of engagement with the quote-unquote historical archive, not to mention the presentation of a very different kind of historical artifact. Mawil's Kinderland follows the youthful struggles of Mirko Błaszczak as he navigates his adolescence in the last years of the GDR. Based on the author's own childhood growing up in East Germany, Kinderland is both a coming-of-age story as well as a semi-autobiographical exploration of childhood on the other side of the Berlin Wall. But instead of focusing exclusively on the politics of the period or government oppression, which characterizes many explorations of GDR history, both inside and outside comics, Kinderland offers a nuanced engagement with East German history through Mawil's exploration of the East German everyday. However, with the same archival artifacts and material culture objects that were collected in German museums after 1999, also emerging on display in comics and graphic novels on East German experience, East German history is arguably being exhibited within graphic narrative alongside brick and mortar cultural institutions. The second half of this presentation thus sets this trend in graphic narrative on East German history in dialogue with the museum practices that are undoubtedly shaping it, arguing that the appearance of the important objects of East German material culture in comics and graphic novels maps onto contemporary social justice-oriented exhibition practices by acknowledging lived experience through the objects that proliferated in the lives of East German citizens. Looking particularly at material culture object in Mawil's Kinderland, which in its English translation has the subtitle, A Childhood in East Berlin, I position object-oriented comics as a kind of curated museum experience in their own right, in the sense that they place objects on display in an effort to communicate something about history. I do this to advocate both for the position of comics and discourses on East German memory culture, as well as for comics and conversations on historical representation more broadly. Mawil's Kinderland opens to a silent panel series featuring elements of the protagonist's room in the quiet of the early morning. Moving through various spaces in Mirko Błaszczak's bedroom, the first panel lingers on the beloved figure of East Germany's most iconic television show, Unser Sandmännchen, who sits on a shelf between two other iconic figures of East German children's programming, Pittiplatsch and Schnatterinchen. The second panel situates the scene temporally with a glimpse at the rising sun out of the young protagonist's bedroom. Hanging on the lamp in front of the window is a blue visor with the faded lettering of the East Berlin Zoo, Tierpark, barely visible in the dim light. The third panel casts its gaze downwards to the desk upon which the lamp presumably sits, where evidence of Mirko's adolescent life clutters its surface. A baseball is propped by the panel wall, a toy construction set forms a makeshift pencil holder, and a flat battery affixed to a small light bulb with a rubber band with traces of the East German BAE logo apparent. And featured in the center of the panel, a copy of the only East German comic book series and an important influence on Mawil, Mosaic. As the viewer takes in the final three panels that make up the 6-panel grid of the first page, objects of the East German childhood remain the focal point. However, these objects no longer hold exclusive relationship to growing up in the GDR. Instead, the emphasis on explicitly East German material culture shifts to introduce the transnational popular culture of childhood. A Smurf, a few games, including a yo-yo and a sliding tile puzzle, a Native American figurine, a race car, and posters of the American television series Alf and Die Olsenbande, which was particularly popular in East Germany after 1970, when DEFA began dubbing the original Danish films. Throughout the rest of the graphic novel, East German objects continue to play important roles within both the frames of the graphic narrative and in framing the story. A blue checkered GDR Tetra Pak of homogenized milk is knocked out of the hands of an unsuspecting student, splashing on the ground in a panel all of its own. The local bullies ride and harass Mirko from a Simpson moped. And a crowd forms around a student with a Nintendo Game Boy from the USSR playing the Russian game, Well, Just You Wait. Here, brand names and logos and storefront signs such as Kaufhalle receive privileged status, positioned front and center in panel frames to draw attention to their iconicity, while the East German prefabricated housing districts, the primary architectural aesthetic of the GDR, is foregrounded in mute panel series and splash pages of East German cityscapes. These panels request that the reader sit with these essential objects of the East German everyday to consider their role in the representation of Marvel's coming-of-age story, as well as in the larger history or historiography of East Germany. With this and other panel series devoted to the quiet contemplation of East German objects and architecture, Kinderland is arguably a veritable object history of East Germany. Moreover, with the emphasis explicitly on East German consumer products, this comic's engagement with the Ostalgie phenomenon, a capitalist-oriented nostalgia for the East German everyday that emerged alongside disappointment with German unification, is abundantly clear. Ultimately, the long silent passages that demand the reader engage these artifacts give the impression that Mavo's graphic novel is yet another curated experience of East German history through the very things that populated those spaces. In this sense, the aesthetic experience of Kinderland shares some of the same design properties as exhibition strategies in displaying the history and everyday culture of the GDR. And with many of the same objects participating in the narrative in Kinderland, equally prominent features in exhibition displays of East German material culture, readers familiar with even one exhibit on East German history and culture would immediately recognize the artifacts of East German Alltagskultur, or everyday culture, shared between museum spaces and comics pages. Thus, Kinderland reveals an important intersection in the display strategies of comics and social justice-oriented exhibition practices, intervening in the memory politics of East German culture that has emerged since 1989 through its engagement with the material culture objects that have come to define East German memory culture. Looking at the framing of similar artifacts of the East German everyday in museum exhibitions on East German history and material culture, however, illuminates the radical display strategies being deployed in comics on the East German everyday today, which, like cultural institutions, similarly seek to present the history of united Germany through objects. However, unlike some of these museums and archives whose focus on history is often at the expense of the lived experience of these people, comics on the East German past draw connections between people and objects that foreground the relationship between East German citizens and their consumer culture, as well as the stories that emerge around these artifacts of the East German everyday. Turning to the permanent collection of Everyday in the GDR in the Museum in der Kulturbrauerei in Prenzlauer Berg in Berlin, however, demonstrates that stories need not be sacrificed to illuminate the larger mechanisms and processes of history. In fact, the stories of history foster the these institutions aim to cultivate in the first place. Through the integration of individual stories into its exhibition of East German history, the Museum in der Kulturbrauerei presents a compromise between the various exhibition strategies of East German culture, which move between the two extremes of white walls and glass cases of the Dokumentationszentrum Alltagskultur in der DDR in Eisenhüttenstadt and the utter chaos of the Alle DDR exhibition in Apolda. Instead, the Everyday in the GDR exhibition presents political information and everyday objects side by side in their permanent exhibition, but not at the expense of the objects' stories. While the museum does incorporate some of the conventional display strategies present in most museums on East German everyday culture, with many artifacts placed behind glass, as well as featuring moments of interactive possibility. The identification of the people who use some of the items on display reveal new impulses in the display of East German objects. Considering most objects in these museums are donated by individuals and families, this particular exhibition strategy might not seem like a radical gesture, but in light of the history of museum practice, the stories behind specific objects within their collections have rarely accompanied them into the exhibition room. While many museums have moved towards the collection of stories alongside the collection of objects of East German experience, these stories remain in museum archives for future generations of researchers as objects of history in their own right. They are not, importantly, exhibited alongside the artifacts of the East German everyday or fundamentally engaged with in many of the museums of East German material culture that have emerged across United Germany since 1989. The Museum in der Kulturbrauerei's explicit exhibition of the stories of the specific objects within their displays therefore makes this exhibition strategy unique. Returning to Kinderland within this context, and through the lens of the Museum in der Kulturbrauerei's exhibition strategies, reveals Marvel's approach to East German consumer culture that aligns itself with trends in these social justice-oriented exhibition practices. Like the Museum in der Kulturbrauerei, comics on the East German past that incorporate the essential material culture of that historic period frame the objects that populate their narratives within stories. In Kinderland specifically, Marvel's presentation of the East German everyday emerges through stories on East German experience, which, loosely based on his own adolescence in the GDR, position consumer products of that time in direct relationship with the lives of Marvel and his characters. Object-oriented autobiographical and semi-autobiographical stories on East German experience therefore situate the essential artifacts of the East German everyday in terms of their relationship with consumers and their use value in the lives of East German citizens, introducing these artifacts to readers in entirely different terms than their fetishization in many museum exhibitions. No longer the strangely lifeless objects of museum installations, alienated from the people that endowed them with meaning and the context in which they were useful, these household items and material culture objects are instead set in dialogue with the people they served, the places they occupied, and the stories that circulated around them. Comics that incorporate the important objects of history thus signal their historical significance by connecting this history to the stories that comprise their lived experience, while revealing the context for their nostalgic reappraisal simultaneously. Ultimately, if museum exhibitions often reveal more about the present than they do about the past, comics on historical subjects that incorporate the important objects of their historical inquiry and reposition them within the context of their historical relevance reframe these museum artifacts to say something meaningful about the past again. The GDR disappeared more than 2 decades ago, but its household objects remain, signifying a vanished way of life as much as they are advocating for the development of a shared contemporary culture. Trabis, the iconic East German brand of car, continue to drive through the streets of Leipzig. East German egg cups are for purchase in every German gift shop, and one rarely sees a Berlin tourist without some form of Ampelmännchen or the figure of the East German crosswalk signal paraphernalia. Flea markets are overrun by antiquated reminders of the East German everyday, and visiting East German material culture exhibits has become an essential addition to any tourist itinerary. With the East German everyday unequivocally tied to the politics of the former GDR, its material culture was not different, and the inherently political nature of these objects did not disappear the moment the Berlin Wall did. These objects from former East Germany therefore leave complex trails behind that not only uncover detailed accounts of the history of the object, but can help us to better understand the social, cultural, economic, and political context of their time. As icons of socialist consumerism, symbols for socialist modernity, and markers for the compromises made by the state in confrontation with the demands of a powerful domestic sphere, These objects signal the reciprocity that existed between East German authorities and individual citizens in general. Since 1989, the meaning of these representations of East German experience and its material object culture has shifted, and they have since become, quote, sites for resistance against the multiple discourses of Western-style consumerism that so frequently forecloses, or at least dismisses, the radical, different social and historical experiences of the residents of the new federal states, end quote. These signs, symbols, products, slogans, and rituals from the East German everyday are the semantics of a common discourse, which has served ordinary people in processing the loss of their former lives and their nation's Swiss disassembling. Moreover, with every East German also a consumer of East German goods, there exists an exclusive identity for East Germans as former consumers and purchasers of these products. In this sense, Nostalgie is not just about nostalgia. It's a form of personal therapy after the shock of reunification, as well as an amateurish attempt to regain one's interpretational powers over one's own biography. With the mental and emotional impact of the radical economic changes that took place in the GDR after 1989, it is unsurprising that East German material and visual culture has become the medium of choice for preserving the memory of East German experience. Through Nostalgie, though Nostalgie is a paradoxical solution to the estrangement and alienation produced by Western capitalism, material culture, as East Germany's new hold on its identity, is also in some ways a logical evolution. After all, what provides a better grip than objects? Yet the museum environment does not present the Nostalgie phenomenon and the preoccupation with East Germany's material culture and historical artifacts as nuanced and complex it is. For example, as Daphne Bradal observes, quote, this framing of Eastern German identities and resistance to Western German dominance in terms of product choices and mass merchandising, end quote, is complex since it embodies, quote, practices that both contest and affirm the new order of the consumer market economy, end quote. So while Nostalgie fits into capitalist modes of approval and rejection via the politics of consumption of unified Germany, it is also clear that East Germans have unique ownership of it. Nostalgie therefore functions both internal and external to the hegemonic discourse, which seeks to dismiss positive perceptions of the GDR, while also revealing how East Germans are actively resisting Western superiority through their purchasing power. In light of the new significance associated with the East German everyday and its material culture, as both means for individual acts of remembering, as well as signifiers for collective identity, the objects and visual culture of East German history warrant significant attention. Turning to the way in which East German material culture is mobilized, framed, and displayed, therefore reveals the complex nature of post-unification East German identity politics. Moreover, examining these phenomena inside and outside of the museum environment, while setting the two in dialogue, demonstrates many issues in the administration of East German memory, material culture, and recent history. Looking at the role of objects and comics on East German experience sheds new light on the continued relevance of East German material culture today, while also demonstrating how graphic narrative and exhibition practices can intersect in significant ways. In conclusion, comics and graphic novels on East German experience engage the historical archive in creative and meaningful ways. These comics push the boundaries of other documentary media to intervene in debates on the representation of history, specifically as seen in Berlin, A City Divided, through the incorporation of an imagined, drawn historical reality that acknowledges its own construction as a representation. Graphic historiography offers a version of that history that does not claim to be objective. Then, in Marvel's Kinderland, we see how graphic narrative is complicating the exhibition of East German material culture by positioning these objects in dialogue with the people, places, and stories that defined it. Ultimately, by offering opportunities for the reevaluation of conventions in institutionalized memory culture through the hand-drawn image, graphic historiography acknowledges the subjects and subjectivity foundational in historical representation. Comics do not pretend that they are an objective presentation of lived experience. Instead, the form thematizes the very mediation that other documentary media seek to obscure. They thereby produce an image more to itself as a representation, literally drawing attention to its composition and constructed nature. Graphic historiography thereby, at its core, thematizes the artifice of history itself with every reproduction of artifact, every decontextualized quote, and every faithfully drawn archival image. While attempting to establish credibility, it fundamentally denies the very possibility of truth claims. Thus, by drawing attention to its own constructed nature, graphic historiography asserts its truthfulness not in its representation of the real, but in its thematization of the very inability to represent anything real, demonstrating that all stories, even histories, are subjective, curated, and constructed. Thank you. Oh, I don't think we can hear you. You're muted.
Sorry, made that mistake. I wanted to say thank you very much for that talk. I would like to open the floor for questions. We have about 12 minutes or so, and it's quite intimate, so feel free to raise your hand and I can unmute you so that you can speak. Or of course you can use the chat or Q&A to pose any questions that you may have.
Can I ask the first question, if possible, Rousseau? Hi, Biz, I really enjoyed your paper. I'm really fascinated by the connection between the haptic drawn nature of the comic and history. So I had two questions, if you wouldn't mind. The first one, I think you do come on to, is the hand-drawn nature, the subjective, there's the stylistics. And okay, the two graphic novels that you showed us there, one of them has more the cartoonish approach in Kinderland. The other one has a much more, I won't use the word documentary, a much more, dare I say, representational feel. I mean, I say even actually quite an nostalgia image of a rigger, again, to the image, and everything black and white as well, and one's in colour. So I wonder if you could first of all sort of comment on the stylistic choices of representational style, because they do iterate. Again, you've got the Smurf on the first page of Hinterland. They do intimate a different connectivity with history. And I wonder if you could talk about the style of drawing.
Yeah, no, that's a very good. So there's so many layers to this category of graphic narrative, and the many things that have to be taken into account in assessing what they're trying to do with history. For example, Berlin, A City Divided was created by two West Germans, and it is financially supported by some of these like formalized institutions of memory culture. And so there's in some ways an agenda behind the stories that are being told within it. And so I have to take a critical perspective on what the agenda between these different graphic novels are and how they set themselves apart, even while I'm trying to talk about them together in terms of how they engage larger practices and memory culture. And so Berlin, A City Divided was intended as like comparable to a documentary film. And one of the really interesting parts of this story that I haven't figured out how to work with yet is one of the final story. I was watching another documentary film about the fall of the Berlin Wall, and it's the same family from a different perspective. And so there are documentary films that are being created about some of these stories as well. So it's very clearly in dialogue with the sort of somber approach, clarifying some of the facts of the oppressive qualities of living in the GDR, versus Kinderland, which is a very lighthearted, silly, funny, coming-of-age story that just happens to really engage with material culture objects. And it's a semi-autobiography about the protagonist's childhood. And so that lightheartedness, the playfulness of that childhood only sometimes rubs up against the politics of the GDR. So the goals of these different works sort of inform how the images are represented and the tone of the works themselves. And so and if you think about like what it is material culture exhibits are doing with each German history, they're also not an earnest engagement with the politics of the period. I don't think they're playful, but some of them are interactive in a way that's playful and complicated for East Germans themselves to sit in inside of the East German car and drive through former East German district and have the opportunity to smash into other parked cars. There's what history has done with some of this material culture is made it gamified these experiences in a way that's probably problematic. But this being an East German author himself, he's just reminiscing on his childhood, while also I have to talk to him about what he thinks he's doing with objects. First, I always figure out what I think they're doing, what people are doing with the work that they're doing in their comics and graphic novels. And then I check in. I'm like, so what did you think you were doing? And where does this overlap? So yeah, it's such a diverse group of comics and graphic novels that the thing that does unite them is the way that they engage with these larger structures and conventions and memory culture. But aesthetically speaking, in terms of tone, in terms of audience, in terms of visual style, they are still very different. But I think that difference is also meaningful.
Thank you. Did you say you had another question, Claire?
I did. I don't want to hog the floor. I know we haven't got very long, so I'm very happy for another colleague to ask a question. I do have a second question, but I shall keep it in reserve.
While others maybe gather thoughts, maybe I can ask you to elaborate a bit more on, you said that there's this agenda, if you will, in terms of how the exhibitionary culture. Can you maybe elaborate a bit more on what informs that, the institutions involved and its power, if you will, its ability to really shape the memory structure?
Well, so we think of history as always the history of the victors. And this doesn't mean that I support any of the atrocities that occurred during state socialism and under the government of the GDR, which pursued its citizens, spied upon its citizens, was violent, and there was all sorts of horrific events. And so this government did need to fall. At the same time, however, what came of the GDR was essentially absorbed into West Germany. And so all of the institutions that are now retelling the history of the GDR are governed by West German perspectives that are trying to tell, or up until this point, things are changing because we've had enough distance from 1989 to sort of level the playing field a little bit. But historically speaking, the presentation of the history of East Germany was that in which it was inevitable that it would fall and everything would become dictated by the West German government. So there's an agenda behind the kind of perspectives and the kind of stories being told about East Germany that would then lead, teleologically speaking, to the power that West Germany now holds. So there's this subtle agenda on how history was written immediately after 1989, and that dragged into late into the 90s, which was the nostalgie phenomenon, was in many ways a reaction, which is nostalgie is a nostalgia for everything East German, and it was the desire to remember some elements of the former East Germany fondly. Not all of them. There are so many that you cannot remember fondly, but childhood being one example of it, which is what we see in Kinderland. So at this point in this history, we're not seeing the stark division between the remembering East Germany exclusively for the oppressive characteristics of that regime, or the nostalgic mode, which is only remembering East Germany for its consumer culture and childhood experiences and forgetting all of the oppressive qualities. We're meeting a little bit more in the middle, and I think that's also where comics are intervening. They're finding that middle ground where we're seeing the people, we're seeing the lives alongside the narration of that history. And when we see in Kinderland, for example, which is not nostalgie because it does articulate some of the ways in which the oppressive characteristics of the state impacted these children, it's not forgetting it, it's just finding some sort of middle ground that was not which was not how history was told in the early 90s after the fall of the Berlin Wall. Thank you for that question.
Thank you very much. Fascinating. I'm learning a lot as well because this is not really my area, so to speak. Can I bring anyone else in? Any questions for Dr. Nijdam, please? Amrutha. Oh, you're still on mute, so.
Yeah. Yeah. In fact, that was really a fascinating talk, and I'm particularly affected by those graphic panels, which shows that the child's perspective, like the one in which there were images of toys. I don't know whether we could call them as toys from Kinderland. And I'm particularly wondering whether, I don't know if this is really related to your project, but when we see those images, there is a quality of frozenness or stillness for these materials. But it is, in one way, if we think that these objects are not something that occupies space, but these also interferes into the temporal aspect. So in a way, we are seeing these still images, and then there is a whole lot of memories that are carried by these objects. And so in a way, how I was really fascinated. I don't know if this is a question, but I love the way these still images or still objects mobilizes memory, and in a way carries collective history. So is there any that kind of spatial and temporal quality that grows that goes into these narratives?
Yeah, those are some really great observations. And so one of the ways that I do think about these images is not so much temporally, so I thank you for that, but the way that if we were to see these images in a museum, which we do, all of those things from that first panel you find in the DDR Museum in Berlin, the way that they're static and still and lifeless, but then in the comic they become activated. So we see them interacting with people, that sometimes they have a story all to themselves, like some of these objects, it's as if they are agents of their own narratives. They are utilized, they dictate their surroundings, like that video game, like the role they play in community building. They're no longer these static, lifeless, timeless images that we see in an exhibition space. And so I think that's an important part of it. And then the other thing the second part that you were talking about, how they mobilize memory. And so one of the parts of this chapter that I excised is that I think that these objects are like memory triggers, which is another way we talk about objects in the museum environment, that trigger memories for the readers, but also are developing a shared language through objects between readers from the former East and the former West. And so it's like re-inscribing what this material culture is. In the museum environment, it's fetishized. It's like, oh, look at all of the kitschy colors from 1960s DDR furniture, which, like, to be quite honest, 1960s furniture from West Germany was also super kitschy. And so it fetishizes the aesthetics of it without really like contemplating the relationship it had with people. And material culture was so complicated in East Germany because it was something the citizens demanded. And due to trade embargoes, the kind of materials that the socialist state had access to and didn't have access to dictated the kind of materials that were produced, what plastic looked like, what kitchen articles were made out of. So it was these objects are highly politicized, and that's lost when they're just like, oh, look at the kitschy egg cups in the GDR museum that we can touch, or the Trabi that we can drive into parked vehicles. And so while we don't get all of the politics of the objects themselves and the negotiation that occurred between citizens and government to establish a consumer culture, we do see them in relationship to the people that valued them, and that they were just household objects that were meaningful and not, and having them put on display is complicated for people who used to have it in their living room. So thank you for those observations. That was great. I'm going to make some notes about some of the things I just said. I love these sorts of opportunities to talk. We never think brilliant things in isolation. And so it's always so helpful in clarifying what I actually mean to myself.
Yeah, it's been very fascinating. I think I would find these text graphic narratives and read those whenever I get time.
Yeah, well, one of the reasons why I presented these two is because they're both been translated into English. So if anybody does want to think about Cold War politics by way of graphic narrative, these are two opportunities to do so.
Thank you so much. We've taken up an hour of your time that you've so generously given to us to give us this really fascinating part of your book, which we very much look forward to. So thank you again. And